All right, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us again this week for our weekly Facebook Live conversation. This week, we are going to be talking about housing protections during COVID-19. We know here at CCADV and within our 18 member organizations and Safe Connect, Connecticut's Domestic Violence Resource Hub, the housing stability is a big challenge for victims and survivors always, but especially during COVID-19. So we thought we'd come on today, talk to a few experts in the field, and see what kind of short and long-term solutions the state is putting in place to help individuals struggling with housing stability. So today we are joined by Annie Stockton-Sabrowski, who is the Director of Housing Advocacy with CCADV. We're also joined by Lee Shields Church, who is the Coordinated Access Network Manager with Connecticut Department of Housing, as well as Pamela Heller, who is a staff attorney with Connecticut Fair Housing. So before we jump into the conversation, we're just going to hear some housekeeping from Robin.
Thank you, Liza, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our weekly webinar. Just a few things before we go ahead and get started with the discussion. You are all welcome to field any kind of questions or comments you have. If you're on the Zoom chat, please put them into the chat window to the right of your screen. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, just type into the comments and we will be moderating that as we continue the conversation. Everybody is on mute until the end of the convo, and if you think of anything during the conversation, please just type it in. I'll be moderating that, and please enjoy our discussion, and then at the end we'll host the Q&A. Thank you.
All right, Annie.
All right, thanks Robin, thanks Liza. Welcome everyone. So as Liza said, my name is Annie and I am the Director of Housing Advocacy for the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and I'm really glad that we have this opportunity today to talk about housing, because since this pandemic started, housing has really, things have been changing just on a daily basis. So when you think about, like, we talk about this new normal, and I don't know when that's coming for housing, because it seems like every day the rules are changing, or the policies, or the executive orders. So there's a lot to keep up with in terms of how to make sure we can prevent homelessness or stay housed, or if we're in a home and we need safety, how do we make that happen? So I'm very excited today that we have Lee Shields Church from the Department of Housing and Pam Heller from Connecticut Fair Housing to talk with us today. So I have some questions I'm going to ask them, but I want to start off and just talk a little bit about CCADV and our housing program. Many of you may know that we help victims and survivors of domestic violence, and we have a shelter system, so we're able to shelter people who need safety from domestic violence or who are fleeing domestic violence. But something we started this year was a rapid rehousing program, and I'm very excited. I want to give a shout out to all of our DV advocates across the state and our housing specialists. Since October, we started this program in October, where we look for apartments for families. We get them housed, release them up, and then we provide them with support services so they can maintain their housing. We have housed 81 families since October 1. I'm very excited. So 81 families in Connecticut who are fleeing domestic violence, we've been able to put in apartments. And of that 81, I have it written down here, 46 of those, so 56% of the people we housed, 46 have been housed since mid-March. So we've really been able to use our housing resources to help with getting people out of shelter and finding safety for people that need safe housing. So I just want to give a shout out to all the DV advocates that are working on this project. They're doing a phenomenal job, and it just came at the perfect time to be able to find housing for so many families so quickly. We're housing them it's taking us about 16 days to house families right now. So phenomenal work. So I just wanted to give a little shout out, and that's sort of one of our connections with the Department of Housing and with Lee Shields Church, because this is really a partnership. It's a HUD funded project, but it's a partnership that we have with the Department of Housing, because a lot of the work between domestic violence and homelessness go hand in hand, because there's eligibility across systems. So I want to kick it off by asking Lee, just in general, what she's seeing in terms of needs or struggles, like when people are calling needed housing or needing help with housing. What are you seeing right now as a result of COVID-19 that people are needing help with around housing?
the basic needs have not changed all of that much. It always comes back to affordability for units. And I think now, of course, with the changes in the economy as a result of COVID, increased unemployment rates, people being furloughed, et cetera, I think we find the needs for affordable housing obviously increasing. And so I think anything that has been a challenge in terms of housing in the past has only been magnified as a result of the pandemic. The other need certainly has been access to housing and identification of units. And so when I say access to housing, really being able to identify landlords who are still interested in renting, particularly in light of COVID. So we have certainly had responses from landlords that said, you know what, I'm going to wait to rent my unit because I don't want to show the apartment, or because I don't want to do an inspection, and everyone's being mindful of social distancing right now, and certainly our landlords and property management companies are no different. I think we've also seen an increase from landlords kind of noting their concerns around the economy and concerns about renting in light of some of the tenant protections that the state has put in place that Pam will talk about in a little bit. But really identifying their concerns because of the economy and fear of people losing their jobs or income stability over time.
I'm curious to know, I'm throwing out an extra question here, but I'm just curious if you've heard the opposite at all of landlords that are eager to rent during this time because, maybe they have vacant units and it's tough to find tenants right now, or people that are looking to move. I'm just curious if that's coming up anywhere around the state, that you're hearing from landlords that are saying, yes, I'm really trying to find tenants. Or
yeah, sure. I think there's always a flip side, right? So I think where there are people who have concerns, I think you have other people who see things as a real opportunity. And so certainly an opportunity to engage with people, to rent out those units as well. I think it really comes down to each landlord or property management company, their individual circumstances.
Makes sense. So in terms of what you're seeing, I'm curious to know what the Department of Housing, and I know that there's a ton going on, because not only do you have to look at immediate needs, right? So families that are, or individuals in shelter, how do you get those families out? But then where do you put them? And then what do we do when you can't, when you can't take them into shelter? So I guess, can you talk a little bit about what the Department of Housing is doing to help immediately with people that need housing right away? Are you still putting them in shelter, or are there other alternatives? Or even for people that are living outdoors, what has DOH been doing to help people during this time?
Yeah, so it's as you can imagine, it's been a busy couple of months. I think we had the good fortune of being on the East Coast, where we were able to learn from some of our colleagues out in Seattle, Washington, and LA about what they were doing, because of course those communities were impacted by this pandemic a little bit sooner than we were in Connecticut. So we kind of watched what they were doing a little bit and then expanded upon those ideas. But I think certainly, like any state, there's no roadmap to follow. And so we've really had to do a lot of trial and error, certainly working with our other state departments, like Department of Administrative Services, Department of Public Health, some of our advocacy groups, as well, such as CCADV, of course, Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness, Partnership for Strong Communities. I think it's really been a collaborative planning effort across both public and private entities to make all of this work. Most of our shelters in Connecticut are congregate spaces, meaning that people are in very close proximity to each other. And so we, obviously, when the pandemic first started, we were very fearful of it spreading quickly in the congregate setting. So within the course of a very short time, we looked at a couple of different options about where people could safely be and be able to socially distance, right? Because if you're in a shelter, you're really not able to do that. And again, depending on our shelter, on the shelter, the physical structure kind of really guided some of the decisions that were made. Some of our shelters are wide open spaces with bunk beds. Other shelters are set up more in a dormitory style, so maybe one or two people are sharing a small room. And certainly most of our family shelters, I would say, tend to be spaces where families are able to stay to themselves, perhaps in a room or a small space within the larger setting. So kind of thinking about how we could safely help people to distance, we started to explore hotel options for people as a way to decompress the shelters. So really thinking of, asking shelters to think about what's your physical structure, how can you rearrange your physical structure so that you're able to accommodate the CDC recommendations of 6 feet or more between people. And we certainly asked our shelters to involve their local health departments as well in helping look at their space, think about how to make those decisions. And then for the shelters that needed to create some space, we started to move individuals and families as necessary to hotels around the state. Again, really with the emphasis on a public health response to the pandemic, making sure that people in this particularly vulnerable population were safe themselves, and certainly being mindful that this is a group of people that are often don't have space to go during the day, and so often they go to community settings throughout their communities, and wanting to ensure that we were helping to support the social distance by finding a place where they could stay indoors during the day, often when our emergency shelters are closed. But right now, of course, I think, our emphasis is really transitioned to making sure that those people are housed and connected to housing services. Because, certainly as we think about the reopening of Connecticut, and thinking about bringing people back to our emergency shelter system, what does that look like? How do we keep people safe? How do we keep our staff that are working in emergency shelters safe? And really, I think our overarching response, as it always is really thinking about how are we connecting people back to housing services. So efforts are currently underway to connect people really to any and all housing resources that we have available throughout the state. CCADV obviously playing a big role in that with some of the rapid rehousing funding that you've been using, but also looking at other rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing options that could be available to people.
So Lee, if someone is homeless, or they're going to be homeless imminently, and let's say this happens today, what should someone do? Should they still call 211? Is there a different process with all these different waivers and things happening in place, or what should someone do now if they need help now?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So absolutely, people should still be calling into 211. I think through the coordinated access networks and accessing our shelters, we've been able to move everything remotely to phone appointments, and really have been able to make that transition with great ease. And we find that the access for the people that need and rely on the resources has actually increased as we have gone to phone appointments, because I think it's easier for people to be able to reach out via phone than it may be to coordinate transportation or to coordinate their employment and job schedules to be able to get to an in-person appointment. So 211 is still remaining the first point of contact. 211 will, of course, try to connect someone to any community supports that are available to them first. And then if those community supports are either not in place or the person still is unable to resolve their housing crisis, people are then connected to a local navigator for greater assistance.
Thanks, Lee. I guess I want to point out here, my next question is for Pam. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, but I do want to point out just sort of, you know, we have Lee here and we're talking about homelessness, but I think it's important to recognize that, you know, CCADV, we're the domestic violence system, and then Department of Housing oversees, you know, housing and homelessness, but they're not mutually exclusive systems. So, of course, we are here, so, you know, people can call 211 if they need housing resources, but of course, if people are experiencing domestic violence, they can always reach us via Safe Connect if they need immediate assistance. And then through Safe Connect, we can get you connected to 211 if needed. But I think it's important that we hear what Lee is sharing, because again, it's not mutually exclusive. I mean, we work with people in the DV system that have experienced homelessness. And we also know that within the homeless system, there is domestic violence. So there's people going through the homeless system that are experiencing domestic violence. So we work together really closely. And I think that there may be people that are experiencing both at the same time, or, you know, and also if you are trying to flee domestic violence, you would qualify for a lot of the same resources that someone who is homeless can qualify for. So I don't know, Lee, if there's anything else that I can add to that to explain, but I think it's important to acknowledge that they are, you know, there are two different systems and two different ways to contact, but a lot of the work we do is similar, or it overlaps.
Very, very true. I mean, I think we're also always seeking consultation, not just between DOH and CCADV, but I think all entities that are really working in the homeless service system. And I think, you know, I've been doing services for a long time, and we don't always necessarily know the answer ourselves, but there's people that we can reach out to help figure it out.
Great, thanks, Lee. So Pam, I'm so glad Pam could join us today. I mean, I reach out to Pam all the time when I have legal questions. She's phenomenal. She always knows the answer that I need. So I'm so excited that she could join us today. And I'd like to talk to Pam. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about some of the, I don't know, are they called the waivers or the moratorium on evictions? So a lot of people right now, the state and the federal government have had, they've put measures in place so people can't get evicted right now. But I was wondering if you could touch on that a little bit, just to talk about, you know, what are the protections that are in place? And I wanted some clarification around, you know, is there no one can get evicted right now, or is it you can't get evicted for non-payment of rent, but you can still get evicted for other things? Like what we see a lot is maybe, you know, people are doubled up, where you have people sleeping on your couch, or, you know, you're not adhering to the lease that says there's only, you know, 3 people that can be in the household. So I just was wondering if you could give a little insight into what is happening with evictions in terms of, can you get evicted? Can you not? What can you get evicted for? And what protections are in place if you aren't able to pay your rent right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Annie, and thank you for having me. So there are both state and federal protections in place right now. I think the most sweeping ones are the state protections. Basically, the state has put in place a moratorium on even beginning an eviction case in all but one type of situation, and that's serious nuisance. So the circumstances that you mentioned, non-payment of rent, that's definitely not a situation where a landlord should be starting an eviction case. You mentioned like doubling up and other lease violations. Those should not be a basis for an eviction right now. You know, does that mean that all landlords will follow that? No. And some may start an eviction for something like that and claim that it's a serious nuisance. You know, and if that were to happen to someone, they should definitely contact us or contact statewide legal services, because, you know, that would be likely a violation of the moratorium if it wasn't actually a serious nuisance. Our agency has been monitoring evictions that are being filed. The numbers are low, but there are a few landlords and attorneys who have violated the moratorium. So, but overall, the numbers are very low, and people should not be getting served with any type of notice to quit or an eviction complaint right now, unless it really is a serious nuisance, which would be something like, you know, violence towards your landlord or your neighbor. But the type of, you know, situation you mentioned where you just have an extra person in the unit, that would not be a basis. I do also want to mention, related to that, that there may be circumstances where people have, they have someone staying with them because of the current health crisis. And if there is a disability related reason for that, they may be able to get an accommodation under the fair housing laws to change the rule in their lease or in the landlord's policy. So if a family is facing that situation, they should reach out to us and talk about whether an accommodation would be a good option for them.
So if, are there hard and fast dates right now that, you know, you can't get evicted until such and such a date, or is it still kind of changing, or do we have a date of when this will all end and we'll all have to pay our rent again? Is Pam still there? Oh, I don't know if she wants to answer my question. Well, we can move on. We can come back to her if she signs back in. That's a good question, though. Maybe she just doesn't know the answer. She doesn't want to tell us.
Well,
oh, she's back. Oh,
can you hear me now? I'm sorry about that.
no problem. No problem.
I could hear you the whole time. I can definitely answer that question. I'm so sorry. Technology, you know, it must have been a connection issue. But yes, there is a date right now. For the state, it's July 1st, which is when landlords will be allowed to begin eviction cases. Other important dates are June 30th, which is relevant only for properties that are backed by federal entities. That's when that eviction moratorium ends. But since the state moratorium goes longer, it kind of doesn't matter. But those dates could change, and I would encourage people to monitor our website and other places to learn the updates, because we're constantly updating, you know, all of those dates and whatnot. I also want to mention executive order allowed for people to have 2 months to pay their April rent automatically. So that rent is going to become due in June. The governor also allowed, and I'm sorry if this is getting into your other questions, but the governor also allowed people to take 60 days or 2 months to pay their May rent if they put in writing a request to the landlord. So if, you know, by May 10th. So at this point, we're past that date, but for folks who did that, they would have then until July to pay their May rent. It's not actually due until then. So those are some of the dates to kind of keep in mind, but they're all subject to change as well.
So what should someone do? I mean, you mentioned calling your office, but, you know, if you have a landlord that's being aggressive or saying, no, you have to pay or else, you know, I'm gonna lock you out. And I'm just gonna say for the record that I love the landlords we work with, and if it weren't for landlords that are willing to work with us and take a chance on us, I don't know what we do. There's so many good landlords out there in Connecticut that are housing people every day that need a chance. So I have to throw that out there, that we have phenomenal landlords in this state. But for the few and far between that, you know, might convince you or tell you that, nope, you have to pay or else. What do you recommend people do if they need help with that and they don't know what to do because they can't pay the rent and they didn't know they had to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad to hear that, first of all, because I only see situations where there's a problem. So we're not usually seeing the good ones, and I'm sure they are out there, and I'm glad to hear that. But, you know, if a landlord is giving someone incorrect information, I think that the best thing they can do is look for the correct information. Maybe that is going to our website. That's going to ctlawhelp.org. That's a great website that has up-to-date information on what people's obligations are right now, as well as how to contact statewide legal services, how to contact us, how to contact other agencies that can assist. You know, a lockout is something you mentioned. That is a crime. It's actually a crime for a landlord to lock a tenant out. And unfortunately, you know, for some folks, calling the police is not a great option, but that is what, you know, they can do if they're locked out by the landlord, and what I would encourage people to do if they feel safe doing so. So I think that a lockout is a very serious issue, and I hope that that's not happening. I do know firsthand that it has happened, and I also know that landlords are, you know, telling people incorrect information about the executive order, saying that no, that doesn't apply to me, or sorry, it doesn't matter, I want the rent anyway. You know, I mean, I would just say, like, keep your communications in writing as much as possible. So that includes email and text messages, and just try to, you know, verify anything that the landlord's telling you if it doesn't sound right.
Thanks, Pam. So along that line, Lee, the next question I'll ask you, in terms of what the Department of Housing is doing for, you know, long-term planning and strategy. So when we think about, you know, right now we're sort of safe in that if you can't pay your rent right now, that's fine. But, you know, we're looking at come July, August, right, when all of a sudden we have to pay our rent and we have to pay back rent and we have to keep moving forward and pay our rent. People are going to be struggling. So I'm curious to know, I know that the Department of Housing hands are full right now with just figuring out what's going on today, but in terms of looking into the next month, the next 6 months, what is the Department of Housing looking at in terms of future needs and how they can help people going forward in the next, you know, 3 to 6 months, or, you know, however long this is going on for?
Yeah, absolutely. And Pam gave me a really good segue. So I think we are certainly anticipating the need for prevention funding to be able to keep people in their homes. And so the Connecticut Department of Housing has received federal funding through the CARES Act that's called Emergency Solutions Grant Funding, or ESG funding for short. And so in terms of that funding, we're certainly looking at being able to use some of it towards prevention programming for people. And I'm not sure what the details are going to look like. We are still kind of thinking through those details and how people will be able to access those funds. But I think certainly at the statewide level, it's a need that we are certainly anticipating. But in addition to that, you know, as I mentioned before, I think we're looking at any and all available resources that we have to be able to support people's longer term housing needs. Certainly on the coordinated access network and homeless service part of our system, we are also looking at how to increase access to diversion funding as well. So because often we will get calls from individuals or families that say, you know, I have nowhere to go tonight. I've been staying with a family member or friend. I need to come into an emergency shelter. And really our initial response is to try to keep people connected to their natural supports whenever possible, or to keep people connected to that housing situation that they are trying to exit for a variety of reasons. And so we have tried to increase access to what we call diversion funding as a preventative measure to keep people out of our emergency shelters. And then in addition, I had mentioned prevention funding through our ESG resources. We're also looking at opportunities to increase our rapid rehousing dollars. So anyone who does happen to enter into our homeless service system, the goal, of course, is to rapidly exit them out of the homeless service system.
Thanks, Lee. And I think it's important to mention too that when we talk about rapid rehousing or diversion funding, a lot of these you access through calling 211, but also know that when we're talking about this, in some cases it applies to people who are homeless, imminently homeless, and for our system it can often apply to people who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence who have no other resources. So it's really important to take that first step and make that call or contact 211 or Safe Connect to find out if you need those resources and you're not sure if you're eligible for them. So definitely make that call to find out if you need the support and you need the help. So Pam, I want to turn it back over to you to talk a little bit about protection, specifically if you could talk a little bit about the Violence Against Women Act, because I think right now it's a really critical time for families or people who are sheltering in place who they might, I mean, they're in danger, right? So to go back a little bit, so in our rapid rehousing program, in a typical rapid rehousing program, you would rapidly rehouse people from the homeless shelter or someone who's homeless into housing. And our system at CCADV is a little bit different because we don't just take families from our homeless shelter. Actually, I want to say about 40% of the families we've housed during COVID-19 have come directly they fled from one apartment to another apartment. So we haven't had to put them in shelter, which is great. Because you never want to be in shelter, but especially now it's a difficult time to be in shelter. So I just want to talk about, these families that are sheltering in place and maybe they still want to leave, or they need some protections. They want to try to remove an abuser or get an abuser off of a lease. Can you talk a little bit about what the Violence Against Women's Act is, which is also called VAWA, that's what it's usually called. And just talk about have those protections changed? Are we seeing a delay? Is it okay for a housing authority to say, I'm sorry, we can't move you right now, if it's domestic violence related? So lots of questions within that statement, but could you just sort of give us an overview of what that is and what protections are in place currently?
Yeah, absolutely. And, VAWA is in place all the time, right? So these protections exist during COVID, before COVID, after COVID. Nothing has changed the housing authority's obligations or other landlords who are federally funded in any way under VAWA. So there's some basic obligations they have. Probably the most significant one right now would be the emergency transfer provisions. Every entity that's covered by VAWA, so housing authorities and other federally backed landlords, should have an emergency transfer plan in place that they follow. A person who is a survivor or who's fleeing domestic violence needs to make a request to be placed on the emergency transfer list. Now, unfortunately, those units may not be available right away. And that's something that is sometimes just out of the control of the housing authority. And so they will do their best. Typically, in my experience, they will do their best to find a place very quickly for someone who's asked for an emergency transfer due to domestic violence. If people are being told that, no, that's not an option, that's not correct. It definitely is still an option. Nothing along those lines has changed. But again, it is dependent on availability to a certain degree. And, we've had situations with clients who are offered units that don't meet their needs because it's moving them to a place where, for example, their abuser has a relative living already or something of that nature. They can turn that down if it's offered, but they should state in writing what the reason for that is. The other thing they're going to need to do is certification, and they can self-certify, and housing authorities should have a form for this. It's something we were talking about last week, Annie. And they should have a form that people can complete on their own. It's also something that their advocates can complete with them, and they can also use a third-party report, such as a police report or a court order, to verify, to certify that they are, asking for this because of DV. So that's the biggest and most relevant protection. VAWA also offers protection against, and as does the Fair Housing Act actually, against discrimination because of prior housing situations that were the result of domestic violence. So as an example, a person is getting a bad landlord reference because the police were called frequently to their unit. That's not a basis for turning someone down, assuming that the police calls were related to DV. And the final protection to be aware of, this actually applies to all landlords in Connecticut, VAWA or not. If someone needs to terminate their lease in order to flee domestic violence, they just need to provide 30 days notice to do so. And all landlords need to allow that when the situation is DV related. So if a person were living in a household where they needed to leave and they were on the lease, they can give the landlord 30 days notice and no longer have liability for that lease. So those are the protections I think are most important right now to be aware of.
Have you heard of any housing authorities or landlords that, in terms of a lot of people working from home, right? I'm curious if there's been delays or problems with getting a hold of housing authorities to have these conversations, or to put in requests when they need to move or want to vacate their lease.
So I haven't heard of that happening right now. That doesn't mean it's not happening. I haven't had that complaints come in to me, but I have to say I have contacted housing authorities about a variety of issues in the last couple of months while they are working from home, and they have been fairly responsive. But it may be that it takes longer for them to get back to folks, and it may be that that it's easier to reach them via email than phone and things like that. So I would encourage, if someone's trying to reach them, to be persistent. And if you can't reach your assigned worker, for example, try their supervisor. Most housing authorities have contact information, including email addresses, online for directors and whatnot. So I always advise folks to, if you're having a hard time reaching someone, go up the chain, so to speak. Get the next person that you can reach, and the squeaky wheel, gets the attention first, right? So, you may have to do some more of that now, but frankly, that's always kind of something that happens.
So I do have one other question. I didn't mention this question to you before, but something I wanted to throw out there. And I think, and this happens nationwide, but like right now in terms, and this isn't intimate partner violence, but in terms of landlord coercion, I'm just curious if you're seeing any of this, any reports, or what should someone do? So if it's like, I can't pay my rent right now, and the landlord says, well, that's okay, but you can offer me XYZ in exchange. I think for vulnerable populations, is there concern, or this can happen. So I'm just curious to know if you're seeing this, or I guess more importantly, if people are experiencing that landlords are trying to coerce them into things they don't want to do, what do you suggest that they do?
Sure. So, people have, this does happen, and I imagine that it's happening more and will happen more as people experience economic hardship. And, I guess I'm glad to report that we haven't had complaints of it at this point. That doesn't mean, again, it's not happening. But depending on how someone wants to handle it, they can contact our office. Absolutely. That's a complaint that we would take and investigate and help them with. They can seek a protective order, because although it's not IPV, it is, still potentially eligible for that type of order. They can also contact the police and report it. So again, it depends on their comfort level. A lot of folks in that situation, in our experience, don't feel comfortable reporting it, but if they do contact us, we will take it very seriously, and we will, speak with them and talk about their rights and their options at length. So, that's what I would recommend.
Thanks, Pam. So I have, I think I had one other question. Oh, and this question was for Pam, but I'll throw it to Lee also if you have anything you want to add. I mean, I talked about this, the moratorium on evictions, but I just wanted you to wanted to know if there was any other executive orders or any waivers in place right now in Connecticut that our viewers should be aware of around housing or housing security or housing safety. Is there anything that has changed because of COVID-19 that our viewers should be aware of that will help protect them during this time and keep their housing stable?
Well, we talked about eviction, but there are also protections in place for foreclosure. And currently, anyone with a mortgage that's backed by a federal entity, that includes Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, a VA loan, an FHA loan, USDA loan, anyone with that type of mortgage, there is a moratorium in place until June 30th on any type of foreclosure actions. And furthermore, people who already had an a foreclosure pending, those have also been placed on hold until July. So those protections are available. In addition, if you're behind on your mortgage payment, all of those types of loans that I mentioned are offering different programs, including forbearance options. And even if you're not in one of those types of loans, you should inquire with your mortgage lender about what options are, because many banks are doing different types of, forbearance, which basically means we'll give you extra time to pay this. It doesn't forgive the debt. It doesn't, it just is a delayed payment, but it is an option that's out there that people should be aware of.
Great. Thanks for adding that. Lee, is there anything that you would add? I know I didn't prep you with that question either, but just wanted to throw that out there in case you thought of anything important that should be mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of waivers that we have worked with around the federal government, it's not about keeping people in their housing. It's really HUD has allowed for increased access to housing. So, for example, some of the rapid rehousing providers that we work with, including CCADV rapid rehousing providers, no longer have to do in-person inspections. So virtual inspections are allowed. HUD has been a bit more flexible in terms of the amount of rent that a landlord could charge in terms of what can be approved by the program and what's allowable. Things around leasing requirements have been a bit relaxed. Again, all as an attempt to help people gain access to the to housing for people.
Great. I have to say, we definitely at CCADV have taken advantage of the waivers and what HUD has allowed. So it's really been helpful in terms of getting our families into housing quickly. Like I said, we've seen 16-day turnarounds where we've been able to house families. So just a little over 2 weeks it's been taking us to get families safe right now. Pam, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just remembered one other quick thing, which is for folks who are in subsidized housing, they can ask for a very a quick recertification if their income has dropped due to COVID. So in normal times, it takes at least 30 days, if not longer, for this change in rent to go into effect. But for folks who have vouchers or who are in subsidized housing whose income has gone down and therefore their share of the rent should also decrease, there is a process for getting that done quickly. And our website has a letter that you can complete and send it to the housing authority or your landlord to get that done more urgently. So if you're in that situation, definitely check out that letter or contact the housing authority to let them know you need your rent to change right away.
Oh, that's great. Thanks. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I did hear that we have a question, and I'm probably not the one to answer this question. And if you guys don't know the answer, we can just put it in the books and get the answer later. But in terms of confidentiality around addresses, I don't know, Robin or Liza, did you want to throw that question out?
Sorry, are you all set? And then we'll get to the audience questions.
Oh, yeah, the only other question I had was, I guess I just wanted to make sure that people knew from Lee and from Pam, if people have more questions or if they need help, who should they reach out to?
For us, you can contact our main phone number, which I'm happy to give that. It's 860-247-4400. You can also visit our website, which is ctfairhousing.org. I think Liza may have posted ctlawhelp.org. That's a great resource online. And again, Statewide Legal Services is another contact. I don't have their phone number off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to share that with you later.
Great.
Yeah, and I think if someone is facing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, certainly the initial point of contact is 211. If there are more specific questions regarding policies or waivers, things of that nature, people are free to give me a call, and my number is 860-371-9579.
Thanks, Lee.
Mm-hmm.
Now, can I just ask for clarification? When you say if someone is at risk of homelessness, what do you mean by that?
So if someone, typically the time frame that we use across the state is 2 weeks. So if they are, in a circumstance where within the next 2 weeks they do not know where they are going to go, that is a call to 211. And again, 211 is going to have some conversation with the person, try to connect them to other resources before having a conversation about coming into emergency shelter. Especially at this time, I think we want to try to do everything we can to keep people connected to their particular housing situation.
Perfect, thanks. All right, I'm good with questions, so I think we are ready for the audience portion of this presentation.
Thank you so much. We have one coming in from our Facebook Live audience. What can I do in order to get a safe address during the pandemic? I've been unable to get any response from the agencies near me, which would be Fairfield, Connecticut. Any thoughts?
All right, so I think that viewer might be referring to the address confidentiality program. I mean, that is up and running. It should be going. Any domestic violence, any certified domestic violence or sexual assault advocate can get victim or survivors signed up. That's through the Secretary of the State's office. So I don't know if this person had already contacted a domestic violence advocate. It is for individuals who typically have moved to a new address that their abuser would be unaware of. So they get an address in Hartford. It's basically the Secretary of the State's PO box, and that is what is used as their public address. So perhaps if this individual would like to just send a quick message to our Facebook page, I can help get some more direct help for them.
Okay, thank you, Liza. The other question we have coming from our Zoom group chat is, what would be the best way for someone to prove that they are being sexually harassed by their landlord?
I guess I can try to address that. It's not always possible to prove it, but I certainly, want to make people aware that any face-to-face conversations that you have with someone in Connecticut can be legally recorded, as long as you are there and you don't have to get the other person's permission. What you can't do is record phone calls in Connecticut, and you can't leave a recording device in a room to record people without their knowledge. But if you're standing there and you're being interacted with by the landlord, you can record that, and that's going to be good evidence. I always, like I said, any communications with landlords should be via email or text message whenever possible. A third-party witness is also evidence, and with anytime someone calls me with a situation like this or with any type of discrimination, my first response is, I absolutely believe you that this happened, and I I want people to know that if you contact us with that type of situation, you know, I believe you, but it's not always possible to prove it. So that's where this question comes from. And that makes it hard for folks experiencing that situation, as well as for advocates whose hands are tied and not really able to do much. Again, if folks feel comfortable contacting the police will investigate situations like this. There have been some really horrific ones where, and I mean, most likely if the landlord is saying this to you, they've said it to other people. So, you know, if they're comfortable contacting the police, a police investigation would have validity in a civil case as well. So that's, you know, evidence is always tricky.
Thank you very much for that answer. So that is all the questions that we have in our group chat. There's nothing else left in Facebook. So I just want to thank you ladies so much for your time. And then Liza, you want to go ahead and wrap us up?
Okay, sorry. So again, I'm not sure which part of that was muted or unmuted, but again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Annie, Lee, and Pam for sharing your expertise with our audience. Just to wrap up, I do want to quickly share some of the contact information that we talked about earlier. We do want to just make sure folks have the contact information for Safe Connect. That is Connecticut's domestic violence resource hub. Our advocates are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week via call, text, chat, or email. All services are confidential, safe, free, and voluntary. Bilingual services are available. So please feel free to reach out to Safe Connect. Again, call, text, chat, email, ctsafeconnect.org or 888-774-2900. Once you've reached out to Safe Connect, our advocates will get you connected with one of CCADV's 18 member organizations. These are our member organizations across the state that will provide that ongoing support and services to you locally. And if you're having any housing stability issues outside of you know, anything that we in the domestic violence service system can provide to victims and survivors, 211 is the resource to access those services in Connecticut. So you can go to 211ct.org or just dial 211 on your phone and you'll get connected. Again, if you have any questions about today's presentation, please feel free to reach out to Annie. She can be reached at asabrowski@ctcadv.org. And please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And if you can, please join us again next week, next Wednesday at 2 p.m. We'll be joined by CCADV's Director of Legal Advocacy, Geraldine O'Neill-Wild, as well as Merritt LaJoy from the Office of the Victim Advocate, to talk about victim rights during COVID-19, in particular with criminal court cases, and we'll give some updates on where Connecticut's criminal courts stand during COVID-19. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Bye.
Thanks, Liza. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.